In a quiet roadside diner, a woman trying to rebuild her peace faces humiliation from a local gang that mistakes her calm for weakness. Their arrogance turns to menace as they push too far, unaware that Margaret Lawrence once served as a Marine. When their cruelty reignites her discipline and resolve, she takes control of the situation with precision they could never match. But only wait until you see how one night of quiet revenge restored dignity, order, and justice in the most unexpected way. The desert evening stretched endlessly, the sky turning from pale gold to the color of rusted copper. A storm of dust followed the wind along the highway, curling around the wooden sign that read, "Margie's Road Stop." The diner's neon light flickered, humming faintly above the gravel. Inside, Margaret Lawrence moved quietly, as she always did at closing time. She wiped the counter in slow, familiar motions, her eyes occasionally drifting toward the window, where sunset burned in streaks of orange across the horizon. The diner was her sanctuary, simple, clean, predictable. A life measured by the smell of coffee, the sound of the old jukebox, and the way truckers nodded their thanks on their way out. Margaret had spent 7 years building this fragile piece after leaving the Marines. Some nights she sat alone by the window, watching the headlights fade into the dark, almost convincing herself that calm could last forever. But peace, she'd learned, was the most temporary thing in the world. That night, around 9 p.m., a distant sound broke the rhythm. Loud music and the uneven roar of a muffler approaching from down the road. 3 young men in a faded blue car pulled into the gravel lot. The headlights washed the diner's glass front in a cold, white glow. They didn't park neatly. They slid to a stop in a slant, kicking up dust like it was a show of power. Margaret turned down the radio. Her instincts stirred, not fear, but attention. She had heard that kind of arrival before. Years ago, in a different uniform, she'd learned to read a moment before it turned bad. Their steps were heavy, unhurried, and sure of themselves. Travis pushed the door open first. Tall, broad-shouldered, a cocky grin plastered across his face. Behind him trailed Jake, restless, eyes darting like he needed an audience. And Cole, younger, quiet, following because he didn't know what else to do. Their laughter filled the diner before their words did. "Well, this is cozy," Travis said, sweeping the place with an exaggerated look. "Didn't think anyone actually stopped here anymore." Margaret gave a steady nod. "Coffee's hot. Menu's on the board." Travis leaned a little closer across the counter. "You run this place alone?" His voice was light but carried the undercurrent of challenge. Jake smirked behind him, and Cole fidgeted with the lighter in his hand. Margaret caught the tiny tremor of immaturity in their posturing, the kind that came from people who mistook cruelty for confidence. "I do," she replied. "It's small, but it works just fine." They took a booth near the window. One of them turned the jukebox on, filling the space with brash guitar chords that clashed with the soft hum that had filled the diner minutes earlier. As they waited for their food, their jokes got louder, laughter harder, edged with something mocking. Margaret didn't look up. She moved between tables with quiet efficiency, but her reflection in the metal coffee pot betrayed her tightening jaw. The comments turned careless, then personal. "Hey, you were military, weren't you?" Travis said, spotting the old Marine Corps license plate nailed on the wall near the register. "Guess that explains the posture." Jake chuckled. "Must have been rough out there, trading uniforms for aprons." There was nothing overt, nothing to justify a scene, but the tone shifted, respect replaced by mock applause, the kind of disrespect meant to test the limits of decency. Margaret set their plates down gently, her motions even and deliberate. "Eat while it's warm," she said. Travis leaned back in the booth, studying her face as if searching for fear and finding none. "You don't talk much, huh?" "Only when it's worth talking," she replied quietly, meeting his gaze. That silenced him for a moment. The room felt tight, like the air itself had tensed. Her calm wasn't submission. It was the composure of someone who had been through worse storms and lived to tell about them. But for men like Travis, silence didn't register as strength. It looked like weakness, and weakness was what they sought to exploit. Jake got up, carelessly knocking over his glass of soda, so it spilled across the table. Margaret fetched a towel, cleaned it up without a word. Her restraint irritated them. The louder they grew, the quieter she became, until her stillness became more menacing than their noise. Outside, the wind grew stronger. The neon sign flickered again, casting brief shadows on the wall, frames of stillness between laughter. When they finally got up to leave, Travis paused near the counter once more. He tapped the edge of his cup and smiled without warmth. "Thanks for the coffee, Maureen." She didn't answer, just watched as they stepped outside into the dry night, their voices echoing faintly in the distance until the sound of the engine swallowed everything again. Margaret exhaled slowly. The diner was quiet now, but the silence no longer felt peaceful. It was charged, alive with something unsaid. The smell of spilled soda and burnt coffee lingered in the air. She looked around at the overturned stool near the wall, the wet mark on the floor, the mess of crumbs on the counter. To anyone else it would look like a simple act of rudeness. But she knew better. It was a message, the kind that men like Travis left behind when they thought they were untouchable. Margaret stood still for a moment, then went to the back room. The hum of the refrigerator covered the faint sound of a drawer sliding open. She pulled out a small steel box, dented, worn, and heavy with memories she had locked away long ago. For the first time in years she looked at what was inside. Old medals, a folded note, and a keychain with her unit number engraved in fading letters. She whispered under her breath, almost absent-mindedly, the same words she'd once engraved on a tag she no longer wore. "Never invite what you can't handle." When she turned off the lights, the reflection in the diner window wasn't just that of a tired woman. It was the calm before something inevitable, the kind of silence that belongs to those who've already decided to act. Morning came quietly, like the desert itself was holding its breath. A low mist hovered above the highway, softening the edges of the world. Inside the diner, Margaret stood by the window, still. Her reflection looked older, sterner, a woman carved by years and choices she didn't speak of. The cup of coffee in her hand steamed lightly, untouched. She'd been awake all night. The laughter of the men from the previous evening still echoed faintly in her mind, twisting between memory and noise, not because she feared them, but because their ignorance had crossed something sacred. Her peace, the one thing she'd earned. That peace was supposed to last. Now it was cracked. She walked behind the counter, each step deliberate. The diner had survived storms before, real sandstorms that rattled the walls and painted the windows with grit. But this felt different. It wasn't nature. It was the slow, steady decay of respect in the world outside. She'd seen it spreading for years. Margaret took the old key from her pocket and unlocked the supply room. The smell of oil, wood, and dust filled the air, a smell that carried both comfort and remembrance. She pulled down a metal box from the top shelf, the same one she hadn't opened in years. Inside lay fragments of her past, unit patches, service pins, a folded photo of her team standing by military trucks under a dim sunrise. Her gaze lingered on the photo. She remembered the feel of sand under her gear, the sound of distant rotors, the steady voice of Sergeant Davis saying, "Control doesn't mean silence, it means direction." That voice came back now, not as memory, but as instruction. She sat down at the workbench, laid out the contents of the box with precision. No weapons, no aggression, just discipline, order, purpose. That was her advantage. Men like Travis thrived on reaction. They mistook calm for surrender. She picked up a small, leather-bound notebook from the drawer. Inside were handwritten notes, formulas for inventory, maintenance lists, and one page of something else, a short motto she'd written years ago. "Peace is earned, not granted." Those words hit differently now. The phone rang, jolting her from thought. It was Sheriff Coleman, his tone casual but cautious. "Heard there was a little trouble at your place last night," he said. "A little," she replied evenly. "They've been around town lately. Boys with a little too much free time. Leave it alone, Margaret. They'll get bored." "They won't," she said quietly. "People like that don't stop because they're bored. They stop because someone stands up." There was a silence on the line, the kind that carried both understanding and worry. "Just be careful," he muttered. "You've done enough fighting in your life." "I thought so too," she answered before hanging up. The day dragged on, customers stopping by briefly, travelers, routine faces, all unaware that the balance inside one small diner had already shifted. To them, Margaret looked unchanged, composed, mild, polite. But behind her quiet eyes, careful gears had begun to turn. She mapped out the next evening in her head. Every light switch, each blind spot from the parking lot, the timing of deliveries, the position of the exterior camera she'd installed after last winter's break-in. She was not planning violence, she was planning control. If they came back, and she knew they would not find the same woman they mocked. As the sun set again, the horizon glowed blood orange, darker than the night before. Margaret locked the diner early. She sat in the back room, humming faintly, mechanical, calming herself through familiarity. The clock ticked softly beside her, its rhythm steady and clear. She tightened a screw on a stool's leg, fixed a loose hinge, repaired a broken sign, small acts that filled her hands and steadied her thoughts. When she finally stepped outside, the desert was silent. The air held that specific weight, like the pause before an unpredictable storm. She looked down the highway, where the wind carried faint dust over cracked asphalt. Her pulse was slow, deliberate. Margaret wasn't angry, not anymore. Anger was noise, and she'd learned to live without noise. What she carried now was focus, sharp and silent. Somewhere deep inside, the Marine in her wasn't waking up again. She'd simply never left. And as the first stars appeared above the horizon, one thing was certain. Peace would return, but only when she decided it was time. As darkness enveloped the desert, Margaret meticulously prepared her diner for what she expected would be another confrontation. She moved through the familiar spaces with focused resolve, locking doors, adjusting the lights, and double-checking every blind spot and exit. Her mind replayed the previous encounters in precise detail, identifying weaknesses in the men's approach and her own setup. Years of training had conditioned her to anticipate, not to react. Through the dim glow of her kitchen, she watched as the same car slowly rolled into the lot. Margaret noted the brashness in their arrival, the way Travis led with swagger, and Jake followed with restless energy, while Cole hesitated, glancing nervously at the main road. She kept her figure hidden behind half-closed blinds, listening as they approached with laughter that sounded forced and uncertain in the hush of the night. The moment they stepped inside, Margaret greeted them in a calm, unyielding tone. Her presence made the atmosphere shift. All bravado seemed muted under her quiet authority. Travis tried to assert control, demanding answers and attempting weak jokes, but was met by Margaret's composed responses. She gave nothing away. Every word and gesture was a deliberate act of control. Jake began pacing, frustrated by the lack of the reaction he hoped for. Cole stayed near the exit, torn between loyalty to his friends and discomfort with the intimidation. Margaret never raised her voice or threatened, yet the tension climbed with each passing moment. Suddenly the radio at the counter flickered on, filling the silence with ambient music and sending a ripple of unease through the room. Travis faltered, sensing an unfamiliar power. Margaret remained motionless, her gaze unwavering. "There's nothing here for you," she said, each syllable calm and final. Travis tried to challenge her, but Jake and Cole quickly lost their appetite for the confrontation. Realizing they would not get what they wanted, and unable to provoke a loss of composure, Jake convinced Travis to leave. Cole slipped out first, followed by Jake and then Travis, whose pride forced him to glare back one last time. The car sped off into the night. Margaret waited until the silence settled, then locked the door and stood alone at the counter. The desert wind howled outside, but inside her diner the only sound was the steady hum of the refrigerator. Margaret felt resolve, not relief. Her quiet strength had prevailed without conflict. She glanced at herself in the window's reflection, calm, focused, and unchanged. Tonight she had shown that dignity and preparation are sometimes all that is needed to overcome aggression. The desert dawn broke slow, silver, and calm. The air was cooler than it had been in weeks, and for the first time in many months, Margaret allowed herself to sit outside the diner, a mug of steaming coffee warming her hands. The horizon stretched endlessly, the pale sun cutting through thin clouds, painting the sand into shades of gold and amber. The quiet should have been reassuring, but this morning it held an unfamiliar weight, the stillness that comes when a chapter in life has closed. Margaret had spent most of the night cleaning. Each movement felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. She scrubbed every countertop, repaired the loose light switch, and replaced the old sign on the door. There was no music, no background hum, only the persistent rhythm of her breath and the soft scrape of cloth against stainless steel. It wasn't about restoring order to the diner. It was about restoring it to herself. As she worked, her thoughts drifted between past and present, the long years of service, the faces of friends she once commanded, and the memory of that young recruit who once told her, "Sergeant, you don't fight for peace. You fight to understand it." For the first time she truly understood what he meant. Peace wasn't silence after chaos. It was the ability to live through chaos without losing balance. The phone rang mid-morning. Sheriff Coleman's voice carried through, quieter than usual. "Morning, Margaret. The boys came by the station last night." "I figured they might," she said, pouring another cup of coffee. He hesitated before continuing. "They won't be bothering you again. Guess they got the message. They looked different." "People change when they meet themselves," she replied. After they hung up, she leaned back in her chair and looked out at the empty road. The world was already returning to its quiet rhythm, trucks humming past, the occasional tumbleweed skipping across the asphalt. Still, something had shifted in her. Not fear, not pride, but a kind of understanding that strength didn't always roar. Sometimes it came in whispers, in choices not to fight, in the courage to stay calm when provoked. By noon, a few regulars came in, a trucker with grease on his hands, a family heading north, a young woman with a map folded too many times. They greeted her politely, unaware of the night before, unaware of the invisible line drawn in that diner between cruelty and consequence. Margaret smiled softly, took their orders, brewed the coffee, and listened to their idle chatter. To them, she was just another roadside worker. To herself, she was something steadier, unshakable, perhaps finally at ease. Late evening arrived with the golden glow of the dying day. The desert wind brushed against the windows, carrying the faint scent of sage. Margaret stood behind the counter, polishing the last of the cups, when the bell over the door rang again. But this time it wasn't laughter or swagger. It was silence, followed by the hesitant step of someone uncertain. Cole entered, alone. His shoulders slumped, his expression uneasy. He removed his cap, clutching it tightly. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry," he said quietly. "We were stupid. You didn't deserve any of that." Margaret studied him for a moment before nodding. "You learned that faster than most." He nodded, visibly relieved. "Guess some lessons hit harder than others." "They usually do," she said. "Coffee?" He hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Yeah, please." They sat in silence as she poured him a cup and took the stool beside him. The quiet between them wasn't awkward. It was human. Cole stared into his coffee, searching for words. "My dad was like you," he finally said. "Military. Thought I'd be different. Guess I had to learn the same way he did. The hard way." "Maybe," she replied. "But the fact you're here means you didn't waste the lesson." He finished the cup, thanked her, and left. Not hurried, not ashamed, but changed. Margaret watched through the window as he disappeared into the dusk. The soft headlights faded down the road until there was nothing but open desert again. Inside, the diner was still warm from the day. She turned the open sign to closed, switched off the lights one by one, and stood in the center of the room. There was no applause, no reward, only the steady pulse of peace finally earning its place. She sat by the window again, watching as the last streaks of sunlight slipped beneath the horizon. Her reflection stared back at her, calm and resolute. She whispered softly, "Some fights end quietly. That's how they should." The desert night returned. The wind carried its endless lullaby, the kind only solitude understands. And for the first time in years, Margaret closed her eyes not as a soldier guarding against the world, but as a woman who had found her place within it.